All right. Well, I know I've been in my sermon series in Mark. Well, I will be returning to the sermon series in Mark, but for right now, since this will be my only actual Christmas sermon, given that next week will be the candlelight service, I'll be going to the book of Matthew. The book of Matthew, chapter 2. Now, the book of Matthew, chapter 2, is one of the greatest series of events involving Jesus' birth. One of the most well-known ones. Now, just for preface, not next week, but the week after, I will be returning to Mark and hopefully finishing that to the completion of the gospel. But today we're going to be talking about where Jesus was born, what led up to Jesus' birth, and what followed Jesus' birth. Now this morning, Pastor Ken talked about how the shepherds were in the same country watching their flocks by night. And they were the first ones to find out about Jesus' birth outside of his very own parents. And they actually learned some things that they were able to tell Mary that Mary didn't even know. It says that she pondered upon those things. So that's a pretty wonderful, very wonderful event. And quite jealous of the shepherds, but God picked them for a reason, especially since He likened the relationship that He has with His flock to the shepherds and their sheep. But not to dwell too much on that, this is the opening of Matthew chapter 2. It says, "Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem." Now that's just a very quick intro. This is at the time of Herod the king. And though there are actually many people throughout Israel's history that were called Herod, looking at the timeline, there have only been two possibilities for when Jesus was born: Herod the king and Archelaus, who was also sometimes called Herod. But if you look towards the end of the chapter, you find it clear that this is not Archelaus, because it actually mentions Archelaus by name and says that Archelaus succeeded King Herod. But this is King Herod, also known as Herod the Great. Herod the Great was the son of Antipater the Idumean. Now I want to give just a little bit of background onto King Herod. Now most of what I'm going to be getting is from the books of Josephus on the antiquities of the Jews. But there are some very strange things about what Herod would do. For example, Herod executed his wife Mariamne, as well as his sons. It says, regarding Mariamne, Herod, therefore, having no way to save himself from his wife's hatred, thus he was forced to put his wife to death. It says, regarding his sons, Herod slew the sons he had by Mariamne, as he had who were plotting against him. So those who were plotting against him, and his sons, and his wife. And notice, it says, and those who were plotting against him, as those who were plotting against him. Meaning they weren't plotting against him, he was just scared that maybe they would. We see that out of his fear, he then started to fortify the Herodium. The Herodium was one of his great structures. It says he also built fortresses, and he called them Herodion and Hyrcania. Then he was also very suspicious. It says here, "And now Herod altered his testament upon the alteration of his mind, for he appointed Antipas, whom he had before disinherited, to be his successor, and made void that testament which he had made before." Constantly changing things. And it says also he had given orders that upon his death a great number of the principal men of the entire Jewish nation should be shut up in the hippodrome of Jericho and there slain. So what we see throughout these histories, and those were direct quotes from Josephus on the Antiquities, this man was unstable. Very unstable, very paranoid. Just overall a very dangerous man to put in that level of power. Now, he's the son of Antipater the Idumean, also known as an Edomite. So what we learn is that his nature of power was likely seeded from being a member of Israel's greatest sworn enemy, the Edomites. So that may have contributed to his fears. But nevertheless, he was the king. And as king, he sought control, he sought knowledge, he sought as much as he could possibly know about his condition, his security, his strength, and his authority. But it says, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, also known as Magi. That's what the word is magi. Now there's some relation to the word magician, but magicians seem to emulate or imitate the magi. Magi weren't magicians. They weren't going to pull a rabbit out of the hat. But they would do things that were considered magical. They were considered unexplainable. And you'll see an example of one of those things in what I'm about to read. But Herod says, "Where is he that is born king of the Jews?" This is what the wise men say. "Where is he that is born king of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him." Now that's an incredible statement there. They've come to worship him. They knew to follow the star, and they knew that the star would lead to someone to worship. You don't worship prophets. You don't worship wise guides. You worship gods. But it says, when Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Notice, what did they call him in verse 2? They says, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews?" Born King of the Jews. So Herod, the King of the Jews, would be quite troubled. But notice it also says, "in all Jerusalem with him." So what he's feeling, they're feeling. Now, why is that? Did all of Jerusalem fear the King of the Jews? No. But they certainly feared what would follow. They certainly feared that things would follow with that they may not be quite ready for. But it says, when he, that is Herod, had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. He demanded of them where Christ should be born. And they said unto him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus is written by the prophet." Notice, he demands it. Yes, he's not asking friendly, but they answer. They've actually given an answer. This is important to remember by what he asks next. But it says, they sent him in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus is written by the prophet, "And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah. For out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel." Now, this is an incredible passage, but that's, of course, from Micah 5:2. But he says that, of course, that they would come a governor and shall rule my people Israel. Then Herod, when he had privily called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, and said, "Go, and search diligently for the young child, and when ye have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also." Now first, why did he ask when the star appeared? Well, the star likely appeared when the child was born. So he wants to know how old the child would be. He wants to know how old the child would be at that time. They likely said, exactly how long ago it was. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search diligently for the young child, and when you have found him, bring me word again that I may come and worship him also." Isn't that just great? Herod's got quite a change of heart. He's going to come and worship before the Christ. Such a lovely fellow. Or at least he would like them to see him that way. It says, "When they had heard the king, they departed. And lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was." Now this is something a lot of people get wrong. The star didn't stand still. They wouldn't really have known where it was. They followed the star. The star appeared where it was visible to them, and they followed the star. It actually says that they saw it in the east. So it was there when they were in the east, and now they're following it. And then it stands over where the young child was. Now that's incredible. I just want to say, just imagine that. Just get into what it is. You're coming from miles away, miles of desert, miles of desolate terrain. And you're coming along on possibly a camel, maybe a donkey, maybe even just by foot. And you believe that there's something incredible that you're coming to, but this is going to take days, weeks, months, maybe even years. But you're following that star. So as you look into the sky, you can see that star. And you know where to go. You're just trusting this star. Something silent, something that can't speak to you, something that can't argue with you or explain to you. But you trust it. You follow it the whole way. They would have had to stick with it for so long. But it finally led them to the young child. And notice that it doesn't say infant, it says young child. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they were come into the house, they saw the young child. Just remember, they saw the star, they knew they finally found the child. Probably came rushing over. And when they were coming to the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold, and frankincense, and myrrh. This is actually part of the origin of gift giving. When they gave gold, a sign of wealth, a sign of dignity, even actually a sign of tribute in the ancient Near East. They would often pay tribute to a king. Frankincense and myrrh were also royal commodities. Funerary, actually, as well as anointing and incense. But when they saw him and his mother, they fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him those gifts. They had no need of these belongings. They desired to give them unto this child. They had walked this whole way bringing with them. But then it says, and being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. Now, they were warned of God. But there's actually another clue as to why it wouldn't have been smart to go back. And it's very possible God brought this up while they were there. Remember that they answered the first question that Herod asked? They answered the first question about where he should be born. Innocent enough question. Just a city, just a town. And of course they've got their prophecies to explain it's Bethlehem. Well, but here we have a problem. He then asks a wildly different question. This man who was so protective of his throne that he wouldn't even have a wife, wouldn't have children, would constantly change who his successor would be, just wanting to grasp onto that throne, wanting to keep his power, wanting to keep his authority. Then says, "Go and search diligently for the young child, and when you have found him, bring me word again that I may come and worship him also." Why were the king so envious of his own authority, so protective? Why would he be willing to worship someone else? No matter how Herod was trying to push it, that's as transparent as it gets. Herod never wanted to worship, and I don't think they were so foolish as to think he would. But they're warned of God, and they departed into their own country another way. Which they were from another country. They were far, far away. Well, that's a lovely incident, right? It's a lovely truth of what happened. Is these wise men, these magi, came from the east. They had seen the star in the sky and were following the prophecies of Scriptures. And they were trying to find the Christ. And they searched all over. And then they met with the king, who heard that they were seeking him out. And they continued on their way, able to evade the king's questionings. They followed the star, and they followed the star, and they finally got there. And they finally saw Jesus. And then, once they saw their Savior, they presented him with gifts, and then were able to depart home safely, away from the king's grasp. Happily ever after, right? But Christmas continues. It says, "And when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeareth to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, and take the young child and his mother, and flee into Egypt. And be thou there till I bring thee word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. And when he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night, and departed unto Egypt." Now keep in mind, he asked when the star appeared. That is to know when the child was born. "And was there until the death of Herod, that might be fulfilled which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt have I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and all the coasts thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men." 2 years and under. That's also how we know how long it took the wise men to get there. He killed them 2 years and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Now, I had some research into the ancient cities, and I found out that there would have been between 400 and 500 residents in this section that would have been affected. By all the coasts thereof, it's likely referring to the immediate coast to Bethlehem. And it would have been roughly 20 to 25, maybe even 30 children, which is atrocious. It's horrifying. But this is one of the reasons why many of the historians actually tried to overlook it. Because many of the historians tried to paint the Jewish history, such as Josephus, trying to paint in a post-Judean era, Judea, in a more positive light than it was. And the idea that they would let this slaughter of the innocents happen under their watch, the watch of the citizens, would not be something Josephus would have wanted to mention. But fortunately, Matthew mentions this, and I believe Luke also refers to this. There was a slaughter of the innocents. And this occurred to dozens of children. This shows just how terrified Herod was. He just wanted to completely wipe out the chance. But fortunately, Jesus had fled to Egypt. Now, just to be clear, because there's a lot of confusion out there about this, he wasn't hiding in Egypt, you could say. A lot of people wonder how Jesus and his parents spoke the Egyptian dialect and did all. They probably weren't trying to act like Egyptians. The reason they went over there until Herod was gone was Herod was a tyrant. Within his region of governance, it would not be safe for them. They weren't trying to hide. They didn't really care if Herod knew if they were over there. What they cared is that Herod couldn't do anything to them, because he was unstable, unruly, and dangerous. But he did slaughter the innocents, and this was prophesied. It says, this was fulfilled, that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, in Ramah was there a voice heard, lamentation and weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted, because they are not. But when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph, saying, arise and take the young child and his mother, and go into the land of Israel, for they are dead which sought the young child's life. And when he arose and took the young child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. The safe return. And when he heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea, in the room of his father Herod, he was afraid to go thither. Notwithstanding, being warned of God in a dream, he turned aside into the parts of Galilee. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which is spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. This is coming from Judges. Now, Christmas is a lovely set of events. Christmas is one of the most beautiful stories in the Bible, in my opinion. But unfortunately, the most pivotal part of Christmas is not the happiest. Fortunately, it's not Christmas Day, so I'm not killing the mood. But to those of you who may be watching this on Christmas Day, I do apologize for that. But God included this for a reason. God included this information so that we would know that, yes, Luke 2:10 through 11 says that this brings great tidings of great joy to all peoples. But not the entire event was a joyous one. Not the entire event was one that you would want replicated. See, Jesus survived a similar fate to that of Moses. And this is seemingly prophetic in the life of Moses. See, Jesus was called a prophet like unto Moses. What happened to Moses was Moses came from a Hebrew family, but due to an order from the ruler to have all of the younglings killed out of fear of being overthrown, he was saved by Egyptian authority. And the same thing happened to Jesus. Now, of course, their lives weren't an exact duplicate, but that cannot be considered a coincidence. Jesus was the prophet like unto Moses. And as a prophet like unto Moses, Moses himself then later in his life would go through the suffrage, the appointment, then would go through the Red Sea, through the waters, and then into the desert for 40 years. Jesus went through the baptism of the waters and then went into the desert for 40 days. Jesus was showing to them that everything that Moses was, he was also. Everything that they looked to. Moses, if you ask someone who follows Judaism, they would say of men who walked the earth, Moses was probably the greatest. matter of fact, the writings of Moses are first and foremost in their entire scriptures, superior to all other scriptures, as the literal written words of Moses. But Jesus was superior. Jesus' birth was a miracle. Jesus' calling was a miracle. Others heard from abroad, and those who had been nothing but shepherds were not preaching into the cities. He made pastors out of shepherds. What we see is his cousin was born of a barren woman, of a high priest of whom had no child. And he himself was born of a virgin, and was raised by what would be two parents, his mother and what we would now call a stepfather, or an adopted father, Joseph, who was called a just man. See, all of this was put together for a reason. And yes, there was all the authority in the world. See, Herod had authority directly from Rome to do as he pleased. Hence he had so much power. And Herod had evil in his heart. Herod had wickedness, paranoia, and envy in his heart, malice and lying. He was willing to use anyone and anything to do to anyone anything that would keep him in power, keep him with authority. And yet we still have Jesus. See, Jesus couldn't have been killed. Herod tried to and failed. The devil himself tried to tempt Jesus and failed. See, evil can try to do wrong to Jesus, and at one point Jesus himself was almost stoned in a group, and then they failed. Jesus was going to die, but he was going to die in his time, in his way, and as he allotted. And he was not going to let another man's vengefulness, another man's fear get in the way. And for that reason, we can still celebrate to this day. Now, there's a lot of celebrations that happen around the world. We have many celebrations of the gift givers, be it Santa Claus or any of the other traditions. The elves, the reindeer. But there are some more important traditions. More important traditions that I think we often forget. Some that we almost always overlook. And when it comes to Christmas, what we have to understand is that Jesus finds his way in spite of the world's means. You're not going to see Jesus conquered by the world's means unless Jesus himself wants to be conquered. So whenever you say that something of Jesus was conquered by the world in its entirety, I would beg to differ. For that reason, I just want to briefly say why personally I feel Christmas is important to celebrate, and why I was willing to forego my sermon series on Mark for about a week. Is this message from the angel in Luke 2:10 through 11. And the angel said unto them, Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. Which shall be to all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. See, it says, good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. Now, does that exclude us? That does not exclude us. You see, we often think it was just something for that time. that just the shepherds celebrated or just the Magi celebrated, but this was to be good tidings to all peoples. And more than that, is born this day. That's why I celebrate the day. Now, do we know the right date? The date of Christmas comes from, some people have different calculations behind it, but in reality what it was is they believed very early on that his conception happened on the day that he died. And as they knew the day that he died, they put forward 9 months and they got to Christmas. And there's nothing wrong about that. As a matter of fact, the earliest record we have to Christmas predates any record of any other holiday existing on December 25th. That's one of the reasons I appreciate the December 25th holiday. And something that I find people often get wrong is they think that we're not allowed to celebrate Jesus through the means of the world. But let's not forget what the Magi themselves did. The Magi themselves celebrated with gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And some of those are funerary. Funerary to keep the body and to treat the body. And though they were used often by the religious people at the time, they did not start with the religious. They started as a way of keeping the body. You don't need to do that with the true God. What it was a sign of royalty. And something I love about that is that something that would have normally been given to a king or normally been given to other false gods was now being given to Christ. And this isn't the only example of that. As a matter of fact, according to Ezra and Daniel, Ahasuerus and Nebuchadnezzar both went by the name King of Kings. Both of them went by the name King of Kings. But here we have Jesus reclaiming that title in the book of Revelation chapter 19. See, Christ is allowed to claim whatever he wants. For lack of a better words, Christ has the right to everything. Christ doesn't lose something because some other group did this. For example, the Christmas tree. I personally love the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree actually originated in what were called paradise trees, done as part of a paradise play done on December 24th. It was a way of celebrating, and they were decorated with red apples to very much look like the modern Christmas balls. And that was likely changed at some point to make them shinier and to make them not rot. But it doesn't always stay the same. You know, different traditions merge. Christmas and the paradise tree merged. And we get what we have now. But then pagans, of course, copied it and made the Yule tree in the 16th century, I believe. So why do we use it? Why do we celebrate Christ with it? Because we love Christ. The Magi were not part of Judaism, yet they called him the Christ, and they would use Micah. They would use prophecy from Micah. So I just want to say this to everyone. When it comes to Christmas, the important thing is that we worship Jesus. The important thing is not how we worship Jesus. Of course, if you were to go up and set up a Baphomet statue in the middle of your sanctuary, I would have some questions. But if you're worshiping him through one of his creations, be it through a tree or be it through flowers, make sure you focus on Jesus. make sure you focus on the Savior. We don't know exactly when Jesus was born. It's possible that he was born on December 25th, but we don't know that. It seems largely picked because it had a reasonable reason behind it, and there was no other holiday on that day, contrary to Facebook belief. But we picked that day because that's one day that we can all celebrate together. If you were to argue about which day he was born on, one of you is going to be worshiping that day, another is going to be worshiping on the Thursday before, another is going to be worshiping in June, another one in May. Christ didn't care about the day itself. He cared about the worship. That's why it says, "For unto you is born this day." Not, "For unto you this day is born." It's not an emphasis on this day. What is it that we ought to celebrate? His birth. But they didn't celebrate birthdays back then. The Magi didn't show up until years later. They were about as late to the party as you could get. So if they missed his birthday by several years, I think you're allowed to miss it by at least 365 days. So don't get too hung up on the things of the world. If the things of the world are trying to draw you away from Christ, yes, please don't make Christmas about the gifts. Please don't make Christmas about the stories. Saint Nick himself worshipped Jesus. So what we have to remember is that even with Santa Claus, you have to focus on the one that he worshipped. Santa Claus didn't worship himself, Santa Claus worshipped Jesus. And a story for another day, he ended up getting a fist fight over Jesus as well. So please don't get too hung up on the traditions. Some people have their traditions and others have others. My personal family, we like to sometimes have ice cream on the day before Christmas Eve. Can I find that in the Bible? Probably not. But that doesn't mean it's evil. But on top of that, just because you find it in the Bible doesn't also mean it's not evil. What it is your intent. If your intent is for Jesus, to honor Jesus, to remember Jesus, to worship Jesus, do it. But if it's not about Jesus, if it's about the gifts, forget it. If it's about the gift givers, forget it. It's a day to meet with family. Don't get me wrong. To be with family. And for family to get closer together. Similar to how Jesus spent time with his family then. As a matter of fact, Joseph's whole family had to be there in Bethlehem. But more importantly, it's not just getting together for the sake of getting together. You can go meet on an Applebee's any day. And this is not endorsed by Applebee's. It's about getting together for the sake of Christ. Getting together for the sake of worship. Getting together for the sake of remembrance. And getting together for the sake of honoring Him. And I think that's the part that people forget. We do get together with family so well. But do we get together for the right reasons? So that being said, I just want to remind you all why we do what we do. We do it for Jesus. We do it for God. If you set up a Christmas tree for Allah, that's wrong. But if you set up a Christmas tree for Christ, that's right. It's not about the object itself. There's no object made by God that is inherently cursed. God does not make cursed items. God does not make cursed things. And just for the last thing, I want to read this to you. This is Isaiah 60, 13 through 14. It says, "The glory of Lebanon shall come unto thee, the fir tree, the pine, and the box tree together, to beautify the place of my sanctuary, and I will make the place of my feet glorious." The reason I address this so specifically is because so many people I found have been misled by wolves online. Wolves in sheep's clothing who pretend to seek the truth, but what they do is they cause you to doubt the truth of Christ. Not only the truth of Christ, but the truth of His church, the truth of your Christian brethren. And it's not fools falling for this. These are wise people. These are intelligent people. But these are trusting people. People who have mistakenly trusted wolves. Or even just those who have been deceived by wolves. You know, on this Christmas day, Christmas ought to be a day of celebration, a day of rejoicing. And I believe we ought to rejoice in all means possible. If the Lord wants to beautify His sanctuary with a pine tree, who am I to say no? If the Lord wants to beautify His sanctuary with a fir tree, who am I to say no? But if the Lord chooses to beautify His sanctuary with nothing but your worship and your praise, who are you to say no? In the end, as Romans 14 says, we are ultimately judged by the intention of our heart. What is clean to one may not be clean to another. But what you are convicted of in your heart that you ought to worship God with, I encourage you to do so. Do not feel guilty for rejoicing in the birth of the Lord, for it is supposed to bring good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. So do not be afraid of doing that which brings good tidings of great joy. But do not get carried away in it. Herod had all the authority to get what he wanted out of the Magi, out of the wise men. They stayed loyal to what they came for. They did not put their items first. As a matter of fact, they did not receive gifts on Christmas. They gave gifts on Christmas. They did not come to take, but to give. So remember, Christmas is not about what we get from it. What we get is a day of rejoicing. What we get is a day of merriment. And please do not strip yourself of that. Please do not strip yourself of a day of merriment. For we never know when we will not have that day to be merry with the Lord again. Christmas is the most joyous time of the year. The day that Christ Himself came to earth, humbled Himself from God Himself to a child. And we can rejoice in that. We can find glory in that. We can find love in that. But if we're too afraid of loving Him in the wrong way, we will never love Him in the right way. So trust me when I say this, God wants your love. God doesn't care if your love comes through, when you get to heaven, I tell you this, God will not care if your love comes through a hug, through a kiss on the cheek, through words of affirmation, through songs, through prayer. What He cares about is He cares about your love. And how you choose to love Him is what comes from your heart. But it has to be your love for Him. It has to be your glorying Him. It has to be your worship of Him. So this Christmas, focus on Him. Don't focus on the gifts. Receive the gifts as they come, but don't focus on the gifts. Don't focus on St. Nick. Don't focus on the reindeer, the elves, or the 70,000 movies they made about them. They're all fun, and they made some great ones. But that's not the focus. The focus ought to be on the same thing that made men who didn't study the Old Testament come from miles away, from years away, to worship Him. That shepherds to abandon their flock to worship Him. And men to die to worship Him. But with that being said, if you have not placed your trust in Him, and so much trust and love into Him that you would walk across sandy deserts for 2 years, then do you really have trust in Him? Do you really love Him? Would you carry your riches, your best gifts, miles and miles for years, just to give your riches to Him? Because if not, then do you truly have that faith in Him? So I'll tell you this, these Magi did not follow Judaism, but they were willing to. They were not the right religion as we would say, but they were willing to. The shepherds were willing to abandon their work to follow Him and to preach about Him. John the Baptist was willing to risk being decapitated to. All of his disciples were willing to as well. Are you? This is a beautiful story, but not only should teach us the wonderful truth of Christ's birth, His miraculous birth and His love for us, but that what we can do. What people of all types, from all areas, were willing to do. So what are you willing to do? The altar is open. If you have not dedicated your life to Christ, if you have not put your full faith and trust in Him, I invite you to come as we sing. If you have any other prayer requests, whatever need you have, I invite you to come as we sing. And remember this. Remember that on Christmas, what they did before was they gave gifts to Christ, but most importantly, they came and worshipped Him. They bowed down before Him. They sang songs and praised Him. Well, the traditions of old were not the things of now. But what mattered is they didn't all do it the same way. The Magi worshiped differently than the shepherds. But what matters is that they worshipped. They loved. They cared, and they had that compassion. They didn't come for the gifts. They didn't come for the movie. They didn't come for the music. They came for Jesus.